Welcome to the MarTech Matrix, the podcast where technology meets marketing and the future becomes now. Every week, we dive deep into the world of marketing technology, exploring how digital tools, AI, data analytics, and innovative strategies are reshaping the marketing landscape. Join us as we navigate through this complex matrix, interviewing industry experts, dissecting emerging trends, and decoding strategies that are setting the pace in this digital age. Your host, Sean Simon, has spent the last 30 years leading a variety of MarTech companies from broadcast.com to Criteo. Now he is the co-founder of the Cogent Collective, a community where marketing and e-commerce leaders come together to discover and vet solutions that address their business needs, bypassing all the noise that comes with technology searches. Learn about the community and see if it's a fit for you at cogentcollective.com. Today, Sean speaks with Jordan Bentley, founder and CEO of AudioHook. AudioHook is a media and technology company that helps businesses reach their customers using digital audio and podcast advertising. Audio is a highly fragmented medium split across millions of channels with billions of devices in a medium that typically lacks transparency in data, costs, and inventory. Jordan built AudioHook because he himself was a frustrated media buyer of streaming audio and podcast advertising and knew for the channel to grow, someone needed to address the challenges that were holding it back. Now, get ready to enter the matrix. Here's your host, Sean Simon.
Jordan, welcome to the Matrix. How are you today?
Hey, Sean. Doing good. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm really excited to have you here, mainly because obviously as a podcast host, it's a special thing for me as a medium, and I want to see it succeed for as many people as possible because I think it's a great way to get content. So I'm thrilled to have you here just selfishly. But I also think that for our listeners, it's an opportunity to expose them in a bigger way to I think a medium that is underutilized compared to other channels. And I'm not quite sure why. I have some ideas because I know consumption is much higher than maybe advertising budgets flow to. And I think often about my early days in advertising in the late 90s, early 2000s, when digital budgets were like 2-3% of overall media budgets, but consumption was over 20% on average. And it didn't make any sense, but looking back, it was because there wasn't ad servers and measurement tools and easy ways to scale and deliver creative and optimized media.
And I think you hit it right on the head, right? You said, I'm not sure why, the spend's lacking. The short answer is currently it's just way too hard, right? It's very fractured. Where do I go, right? Where do I go? How do I do this? How do I make an ad? How do I measure it? It's all very disparate and broken. And so when the choices are, I have to go figure out this complex thing, or let me just go put a budget in Facebook's ad platform. It's a pretty easy choice for most marketers that just want to, do their job and aren't looking to, figure out the complexities of a new medium.
Yeah, I think that it's a huge part of it. I also think up until, this is starting to change this year, but other mediums were easy to track, right? You had clicks and boom, and you can follow it all the way through. MTA worked. But with cookies going away, it's getting more and more difficult to do that. So I think hopefully people will open up their minds to other channels. And you see that with CTV, right? So hopefully we see that with audio as well. Before we get into how should someone get into the audio space, or maybe educating the audience on misconceptions, talk to us about why you created AudioHook. What was your experience that led you to building this platform? What was the problem you were trying to solve for?
Yeah, so that's a great segue. A little bit about my background. I got into digital advertising back in roughly 2013 and have always been a fan of audio. At the time in 2014, 2015, podcasting was still fairly small. A lot of these channels hadn't emerged or gotten kind of the scale they've got today. And so around 2018, 2019, I was like, hey, Spotify's pretty big, Pandora's pretty big, podcasting is growing. Like, I'd love to go run a campaign, right? And at the time, I had access to some seats on a few different DSPs, demand side platforms, and just went to run an audio campaign. I was like, all right, they offer audio. How hard can this be? And it turned, as it turns out, much harder than I thought. The first DSP that I tried to run an audio campaign on, they said that they supported audio, but we would need our own audio ad server because they didn't support serving the audio files themselves. And I was like, okay, well, there's a ton of third-party ad servers out there, lots of fairly inexpensive options. I'm sure I can find one, not a big deal. And so I Googled, audio ad server, and long story short, I couldn't really find many. I found a couple. They were all really expensive, very much geared towards enterprise plans and not for some marketer. And I was like, that's interesting. We ended up kind of getting past that hurdle and then went to run a campaign. And that's where we found another stumbling block, which was, okay, there's millions of podcasts out there. There's tens of thousands of radio stations. But we were only able to access a very small fraction of that programmatically. And I was like, that's weird, right? In the display world, you can access almost anything programmatically.
Sure.
Certainly in video, with the exception of maybe a walled garden here or there, you can access everything. And as it turns out, audio is just very fractured, and most of that inventory is just not connected to programmatic pipes. And which got me kind of thinking, okay, why isn't this stuff connected to programmatic pipes? And what I ended up realizing and finding out after I had conversations with senior executives at a number of trading platforms and DSPs was that audio spend relative to the darling CTV, audio spend was tiny, right? It was absolutely tiny. You're talking single digit percentages, right? So when you have a fast growing channel like CTV that is just on a tear and it's making the trade desk look really good, it's making Magnite look really good, all this M&A activity, and then you have audio spend at like 3%, right? Go figure, DSPs and SSPs don't want to spend valuable engineering and product resources investing in this channel. And that was the simple answer. There just wasn't the spend there to justify the innovation in that category. And then you kind of got this chicken and egg problem where, okay, well, how do we get the spend higher? Well, you kind of need to get the inventory. You kind of need to get the tools. Well, how do we get the tools in the inventory? Well, you need the spend there. And it became clear that nobody's going to fix this. And if, I wanted it fixed, it was something that I was going to have to jump into. And so that is how audio came to be. Candidly, when I first started thinking about it, I was like, again, I'd been in the space about 8 years. I knew that there were a lot of DSPs out there. I knew that there were a lot of DSPs that had gone out of business. Most of them financially had not done very well. So it's kind of like embarking on a trek that most people die. And I was like, And so I was kind of reticent to do this. And I was just kind of thinking about it. And what was interesting is that one of the DSPs that I had tried to run an audio campaign on, they ended up contacting me and saying, hey, you were able to figure out an audio ad server. We have other customers that would like to run audio. Can they use your audio ad server? And I was like, oh, yeah, sure, right. And I got one referral, and then sure enough, another week, hey, another person would like to run audio. And, over the span of, a month or two, I had like 10 referrals from a DSP saying, hey, these people all want to run audio. The other really interesting thing about this, Sean, all of those companies had one thing in common. They were all building CTV products. So they were all building CTV products, and I'd get on these calls and they'd be like, hey, we have the CTV product, but our customers are also wanting to run audio and we can't run it. Is this something that you could help us with? And that was actually the nexus that was like, okay, I know, everybody dies building a DSP. It has a lot of uphill challenges, but like 10 referrals in a month or two, that's got to count for something. So ready or not, here we go.
Well, what was the landscape? So you're describing 10 years ago, right? 10, 11 years ago.
Well, this was in 2019.
Oh,
so this is 4 years
2013. Ago. Okay.
So I first got into the space in 2013, got it. But all of this was much later, 2019.
Wow. So this is 4 years. So 4 years ago, the landscape was, I'm just trying to think back. I mean, this is pre-pandemic. So you got Spotify, Pandora, iHeart. I'm talking about the consumer access points, and maybe Sirius, but Sirius probably was more streaming audio radio than it was podcast at the time. Is that a fair picture of the landscape? So if you were a consumer, those were your choices. And if you wanted to start a podcast, you were probably limited to some smaller company at the time that's probably owned by somebody else right now.
Yeah. Again, as from a consumer perspective, right? And this is part of some of the challenges of audio from a marketer's perspective. You have streaming, and then, so Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, some of the names we just talked about. But then you have radio, right? So, hey, 97.1 ZHT, I'm here in Utah, right? That's an iHeart station. Or X96, right? Or 100.3. So we have all these FM stations, FM and AM stations, and it turns out there's about 16,000 in the US. And then you have millions of podcasts. So, and consumers largely access that through Apple's podcast player. Certainly you can listen to them through Pandora and Spotify, and there's a number of other apps out there. So depending on what type of audio, there was kind of a different access point. So yes, you're right. If you were listening to streaming radio and you're like, oh yeah, let me call up Pandora or call up Spotify. What was actually interesting at the time is as we started executing these audio campaigns, Spotify's approach to monetization is kind of evolved in how they allocate inventory. But at the time, Spotify didn't allocate much of their inventory programmatically. It was almost all consumed in the upfronts. And so we would have months where we were buying, tens of thousands of dollars of audio from Spotify. But then the last month in each quarter, all of that inventory would dry up. And you would be lucky to get 10 impressions a day. I'm not joking. You were spending $1. Your campaigns just wouldn't serve anything because Spotify was taking all that inventory to help fill their guaranteed campaigns. You just couldn't buy anything programmatically. The other thing is the CPMs would spike. So usually you could buy it for $15, $16. Towards the end of each quarter, right, you were bidding $25, $30, $35, and you couldn't get anything. And so even people that, knew the consumer facing apps like Spotify, there wasn't a lot of inventory. And so that was this other challenge that we started to realize was it's not that streaming is enough on its own or that podcasting or that radio. You really need to take a holistic approach and leverage all three, right? Because there are some people that love their streaming and don't do a lot of podcasts. There are some people that listen to tons of podcasts and don't do as much streaming and a mix in between. Mm-hmm. And so it's all these channels work together. It's not necessarily oh, should I do X or Y? It's you really need to do X and Y. And the existing DSPs just didn't have a lot of inventory in really any channel, podcasting, streaming, or digital radio.
So that's, I'll ask you a couple of questions here at the same time. Take it as you want. Fast forward 4 years, it's 2024, 5 years. How has the landscape changed for a marketer? And I want to talk about podcasting, and I think there might be a transition here where so many advertisers leaned into podcasting because they liked the host read ads. But I feel like I've always felt like there's a bigger opportunity in that content because it's so niche to speak to that audience in other ways, right? Through dynamic ads, like typical advertising in an audio spot. So talk to us about the landscape first, and then maybe a little bit about specifically podcasts.
Yeah. So in many ways, the landscape's still very similar today, right? You still have Pandora and Spotify, which largely make up the streaming options. Spotify has changed kind of how they allocate inventory, so there is more available to buy programmatically. But again, Spotify's base is primarily ad supported, so it's still kind of limited. Digital radio continues to grow from a consumer standpoint. It's now double digit percentages. So more than 10% of people that listen to the radio do so digitally. And that portion continues to grow each year. And so you're getting more consumer engagement there. And podcasting has continued to, be really popular. There's lots of stats out there about, more people listen to podcasts than like watch Netflix and crazy stats like that. So from a consumer standpoint, just more adoption. From a marketer standpoint, these challenges still largely continue to exist today. And again, that's why we founded AudioHook and the problem we're working to solve there. But it's still very fractured, and it's still like, hey, where do I go to where's my one-stop shop where I can go execute campaigns across these channels, execute my campaign, measure it, understand how it worked, make optimizations, and continue to invest in the medium.
What about, you mentioned something earlier, it's easy to buy social, right? You go to Meta, you upload your creative, you add some budget, and you got massive scale. Billions of users globally. How, you talked about the challenges with the individual platforms. How does a marketer enter the audio space? All of it, not just one of it, not just streaming or podcast, but how do they enter it and get scale against the target audience that they're trying to reach, regardless of what the audience is?
Yeah. So again, to get scale, you really need to leverage all three channels. So streaming, digital radio, and podcasting. One of the challenges historically in this space is you have three kind of historically big players: Spotify, that we talked about, iHeartRadio, and then Pandora or SiriusXM. SiriusXM bought Pandora. All of those three companies are very competitive to each other. And so as a result, you have this interesting dynamic where neither of them will kind of cross-sell inventory. So for example, Spotify doesn't want to sell Pandora inventory, naturally.
Sure.
Pandora can't sell Spotify inventory. And so it creates these pools of isolation. So most marketers, their initial thought is like, oh, let me reach out to Spotify. Let me reach out to Pandora. Let me reach out to iHeart. And they all have advertising solutions and services that they can offer you. The challenge, though, is with each one of those, you're just getting a subset of the market. And none of them control even, the half the market or the majority of the market. So with any given, I refer to these as publishers that you reach out to, at best, you're getting 20 to 25% of the market. And so again, this is what creates like a lot of work for marketers. It's like, hey, if you want to reach 60 or 70% of the market, well, now you have to either reach out to 3 or 4 different players, or you have to do a bunch of work. Now, selfishly, I'll plug AudioHook here. AudioHook is an independent player. We have access to all of those sources of inventory. We don't own any inventory ourselves, so we're able to buy from all three of those and not have any conflicts. And so with AudioHook, you're able to, consume and target streaming, digital radio, and podcasting. But yeah, that's why it's still a challenge today, because there aren't a lot of solutions outside of AudioHook that enable you to get the scale you need.
Yeah, it feels like display 2010, right? 2011, 2012. Exchanges were out there. Nobody knew how to access them. They were hard and expensive. Then DSPs popped up, right? The media mats of the world, and obviously the trade desk being the biggest one today. Talk to us about how there's a handful of large and mostly mid-sized DSPs out there that are, I go say, more general, right? You can buy display, you can buy video or CTV, you can buy audio. Where does an audio hook being specifically audio, how does that compare to some of these more general DSPs? Is it the same thing? So if I'm buying all of my other media from those platforms, is it this, if I just throw on audio, am I getting the same thing I'm getting from Audio Hook? And then I want to talk about what are some of the advantages of working with Audio Hook in terms of addressing the problems you identified earlier in your career. But take the first one.
Yeah. So, I think the difference is if we use an analogy like, a bicycle store, right? You can go buy a bike from Target or Walmart or, some of these big box retailers. Or you can go to like a local specialized bicycle shop that then carries a bunch of stuff, right? Is there anything inherently wrong or bad or inferior about Target's bikes that they sell or Walmart's or whoever? No, certainly not. With that being said, they generally have less selection, right? They're generally not as educated on it. They may not have some of the higher end products, right? They're going to be focused more on like, hey, what do most people want? And that's what they're going to focus on. Whereas your kind of more specialized bike shops, right? They're going to have all sorts of stuff. They're going to have tandem bikes. They're going to have bigger mountain bikes. They're going to have bikes that are made for snow. They're going to have, carbon fiber race bikes and mountain bikes and all sorts of different things. And so that's the comparison I would make with Audio Hook versus, a generic DSP. There's a lot of great DSPs out there. Certainly not claiming that we're, smarter or better or anything like that. It really comes down to a function of specialization. Because we only focus on audio, we're able to do a bunch of stuff that works well when you build a specific solution. So as an example, targeting an audio, especially podcasting, tends to be a bit trickier. You don't have cookies. You typically don't have maids. And so how do you target this inventory that is many might consider less addressable? Versus like streaming, where you typically on streaming have maids, right? Buying streaming inventory is much similar to buying, display on a mobile app. It's pretty straightforward. But buying radio inventory that, again, maybe in a browser and where you're losing cookies, and buying a podcast on an app where you don't have identifiers, and buying streaming, that starts to get a lot more complex. The other thing is like, you have different like user agent strings, right? That's kind of technical jargon for what app are they using or how are they consuming this, right? So generally speaking, when you're buying display or video, it's like, hey, is this an iPhone? Is this laptop, a Microsoft laptop or a Dell or whatever? In the audio world, right, it tends to be much more focused on the applications, right? Hey, are they using the Apple podcast player? Are they using Spotify? Are they consuming the podcast through Pandora, right? So you can be listening to a podcast through a streaming app like Pandora or Spotify, right? Or is it a smart speaker, right? Your watches, your smart speakers, the only ad units they ever have are audio ad units. And so again, going back to the one size fits all DSPs, their device graphs typically don't know how to handle smart speakers, right? They typically don't know how to handle some of these more nuanced cases, as well as how do you handle attribution? How do you handle frequency capping? Again, not that their teams aren't smart and can't figure it out or build this stuff. They're trying to build a solution that works across, 10 different mediums. And we're trying to build very specific tools that work really, really well for one specific medium.
Yeah, you you said something earlier about being specialized, and it took me back to my time at Criteo when we started Criteo in 2000. Well, I started in 2010 when we first came to the US. And at that time, retargeting was something you just added on to your ad network buy. I had come from the ad network space, and it was just something we threw in. It was a pixel conversion page, and it was a throw in. And then I would go out and meet with clients about Criteo, and they would be like, "Why do I need a point solution retargeter? I get it for free over there." And then once they started working with us, because we specialized in it, they saw how much more effective it was, how much more scale we could generate, how much better ROAS we could drive than the ad network, who wasn't focused on it. They just did it because they could, but they didn't put any product behind it. So I can totally relate to what you're saying there. You talked about measurement a couple of times, and you also talk about no cookies, no base, and in a very fragmented ecosystem, right? So if I'm a marketer and I come on the audio hook and I want to target ads on podcasts against a certain audience or type of programming, and I want to do some streaming audio, how do I measure it to know that my budget is working? I mean, I know there's third-party measurement tools to help with like your media mix, which is certainly a great option because it's a third party. But how do you think about it just within the audio space?
Yeah. So again, I think this is one of those things that you really have to have a catered solution to audio. So if we step back and look at display as an example, or even video, the main measurement metrics that you're looking at in display or video is, are they clicking on it? Is it viewable? Right? In the case of video, what's maybe the completion rate? If we look at that in the case of audio, none of those three really kind of exist. Certainly the notion of viewability largely doesn't apply to audio. You do have audio ad units that may have a companion banner. That's not the majority. That's certainly the minority in the vast majority of cases. So in large part, you don't have a viewability component. There's no ability to click on the audio ad. Again, you can click on a companion ad, but again, they largely aren't present.
Sure.
And then completion rates, generally speaking, are always very high, right? Because it's stitched into the stream. And so in many cases, like, you can't skip it. There isn't a lot of skippable options like there are in video. And so you almost always see, like, not always, but you commonly see very high completion rates in audio. And then you don't have any of those other signals. And so if you were measuring this from a traditional approach, it's really hard to differentiate, like, hey, what inventory is better, right? What inventory is, performing better for me? Because you're just going to look at it on a CPM and then on a, completion basis, and it's all largely going to look the same. And so you may just decide, hey, I should just buy like the cheapest inventory I can find because everything else seems to like work. When we talk about measurement in audio, it's very coupled with attribution, because that's really the big signal that you need to look at to understand if it's working. Display, it's great that you have these other proxies, right? Clicks and viewability that you can sniff out. In audio, you don't have those. And so you generally need to work with an attribution solution to then better understand, hey, I bought whatever, 1 million impressions on this podcast. What kind of lift did that generate for my brand, website traffic? Did it generate any sales? I bought 500,000 ads from this other podcast or from this streaming channel. How did that work? How well did that perform? What kind of lift did I get? And so measurement in audio is very closely coupled with performance. And that's how you can tell the details. Now, the other comment I'll make there is, this is why transparency, frankly, in all media is really important, but especially in podcasting or especially in audio, including podcasting, because oftentimes media is sold, kind of in bundles, if you will, where you don't exactly know what radio station it played on. You don't know exactly what podcast it played on or what device it played on. And so that creates a lot of challenge when you're then trying to look at, okay, what kind of result did this generate on my website, or what kind of lift did this result in for my brand, when it all kind of gets lumped together. And I think that's one of the big, I hear two common things from marketers all the time. And it's either one, hey, I've never ran an audio campaign, or two, we tested audio and it didn't work. I hear that like all the time. And it's like, okay, well, let's understand like this notion of like, hey, I tested audio and it didn't work. And it often is usually one or two of these derivatives where, I bought a big campaign from some publisher. They ran a bunch of impressions and then we didn't see sales. And it's like, and when we ask them about, okay, how are you measuring sales? They often go to promo codes, right? Oh, hey, we told them to mention this promo code, summer 72 blue fun ski jet ski, and nobody mentioned it. And so it clearly didn't work. It was a waste of money. And whenever the promo codes do get answered or do get used, it's funny because the marketers are like, oh yeah, the promo code got used a ton. We think it ended up on like a coupon site or something. So
you can't win.
You can't win. It's either like it doesn't get used and it clearly didn't work, or if it got used, well, it's probably some spam thing. And so, it's an education thing that we're constantly working with marketers and brands to say there are more sophisticated ways of measuring this stuff. Promo codes are in particular not very effective. Consumers do not tend to remember them. What they do remember is your brand. They do remember the overall message. And so you'll often see increases in search traffic, right? Organic search traffic, paid search traffic. And there's a number of attribution solutions out there. Third parties like, Podsites, Podscribe, Magellan. We offer an attribution solution as well that are a little bit more sophisticated than, relying on consumers to remember the promo code or the vanity URL.
Yeah. Promo codes don't work. For anyone listening, I shouldn't say they don't work. They're a proxy, right? We dealt with this in direct mail. Like, it's nice to have on there. Some people will use them. Some people won't. And I think in digital, it's really hard too, because especially if you tell people to go to like a vanity URL, you're like something.com/. Well, as soon as they type in the first part, Google fills it in and they hit enter and you lose the count. So use it as a proxy, not as a measurement tool. Okay. So how does someone get started in the space, or at least with audiohook, whether they're, they have experience or they just want to get into audio for the first time? Is it difficult? And I think what most people gravitate toward is, I don't have an audio spot. How do I get an audio spot? I don't have an ad agency, or my ad agency doesn't do audio creative. How does someone get started with audio or the audio space?
Yeah. So the creative often is kind of the long pole in the tent. People, ask those questions. The good news is there's lots of resources out there. At AudioHook, we can help them generate a creative spot. A lot of other platforms will offer to help create an audio spot as well. And with the proliferation of tools like ChatGPT, it's very easy to like write these scripts. And there's third parties out there like Bunny Studios, where you can provide a script and you can have a professional voice artist record them. We're also seeing with generative AI, really good progress of them being able to generate stuff. I was actually just testing out a tool. Historically, these things have sounded, kind of very robotic, and it's pretty obvious it's a computer. How can I help you? And there was one partner that we're doing some work with, and it's like, wow, this sounds really good. It's getting hard to differentiate between, what's a real voice and what's not a real voice. And so there's, a lot of innovation coming on that front here shortly, where you can just put in your script, generate something in 5 or 10 seconds and have your spot. But yeah, there's a number of resources, and we can certainly help connect marketers with those as well.
Yeah, and give it. I want a female voice with an Australian accent. I want the copy to be persuasive, and and timely, or so much detail you can put in there, just like you would type into Chat GPT. We're speaking about the recording in the beginning, and it took me back in the late '90s. I sold advertising for broadcast.com, or what was Audio before broadcast.com.
Sure.
And I was told we could just we can create ads, because it was the problem for them too. And so I would just tell our advertisers, yeah, we'll create the ad for you. Just give us the script. And then I realized every time I would hear the ad, I'm like, they all sound the same. It was the same voice. And then I went down to our headquarters in Dallas, and we had a recording booth, and there was one guy that worked there who just had a great voice. And so he read all the scripts. And so all of the commercials we created were this one guy. So it's nice now you have some variety with automation and generative AI. What's next? What's on the roadmap? How will AudioHook continue to evolve in a way that will help the audio industry grow, right? Because when we look at the budgets, I think budgets today are somewhere around sub 5%, low single digits of overall marketing budgets nationally, and consumption is well over 20%. So if you're thinking about audio, it's a great time to get in, because you could get tremendous market share. But what's on the roadmap for AudioHook that's going to make it easier and more interesting or enticing for brands to consider audio as a channel?
Yeah, well, it's just what you hit on the head, right? First and foremost, we have to make this easier, right? We have to make it simple. Like most marketers want to provide a great value for their employer or the agency that they're working with, and want to drive ROAS. Right now in audio, we tend to make that more complicated than it needs to be. So first and foremost, we just need to make it easy and effective. And that's by, building out more seamless tools, helping with education, obviously creating audio spots more easily. All of those things help. Additionally, we're, leveraging technology. We're leveraging machine learning to make buying this stuff also more easy. So Google and Facebook have recently released tools that kind of auto-optimize the campaigns for marketers. We're releasing some tools as well that will have similar capabilities. Cool. So a marketer doesn't have to be a perfect expert. They can say, hey, here's my spot, or better yet, here's my website. What do you think would be a compelling copy? Okay, I like that copy. Hey, can you help me make the ad? Okay, great. Now, can you help me know where I should go run it, how it should be targeted, and make sure it's working effectively? And so that's really our end goal, is making it easy so that marketers can be confident that their dollars are being well spent. I will say that, and of course, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid here, Sean, but audio, I believe, is one of the most cost-effective mediums. If you kind of discard email as a medium, because it's basically free to send, it's not really a paid medium. But if you look at paid mediums, social, paid search, TV, audio, billboards, I believe audio is the most cost-effective solution. When you look at ad saturation, audio is incredibly low. When you look at recall, audio is incredibly high. It's one of the highest. And then as you hit on it, because, there's a big gap between how much is being consumed and how much advertisers are allocating dollars here, the costs are incredibly efficient. So you can buy audio at, display like CPMs, but get something that has the retention and recall closer to CTV. It's just, it's a no-brainer, in my opinion.
Yeah, look, I agree. As a consumer, thinking about, there's at least 5 or 6 products that I use on a daily basis that I first heard about on podcast advertising. So it's extremely powerful. And the recall, like digital ads, I don't display ads. I can't tell you the last display ad I actually recognized, but I know the audio ads that I've heard. Obviously TV as well, but I think I listen to more audio than TV. So I totally agree with you. I think there's a huge opportunity there for advertisers, and I like the way you positioned it is like, don't be afraid of the medium because you don't know about it. AudioHook can help educate you, but trust us, trust AudioHook, that there's plenty of technology that's enabling advertisers to use the medium in a very cost-effective way, right down to the creative. So I think that's really helpful. I'd encourage our listeners to at least have a conversation with Jordan and just learn about the space, because it's going to grow, and you can really take advantage of it right now. So,
well, and I think, if you look, learning from history, right, you look at people that adopted paid search early, right? Like, there's like legends about like people buying clicks on Google for 5 cents, right? That were driving, hundreds and thousands of dollars in value. We saw the same thing with Facebook, right? Which was early adopters of Facebook saw ridiculous ROAS. But naturally, as these other platforms, get more well-known and the dollars and the competition for ad spend go up, right, the ROAS and the opportunity kind of washes away. And so paid search, while there are opportunities in paid search, it's largely, most of that opportunity is largely being competed away. You're seeing similar things in social. And so audio is at that early stage where the early adopters really can get an outsized return, which is why you see a lot of, direct response brands investing heavily in it, because it's working great for them and they're trying to double down while, the getting's good and before it becomes more competitive from a CPM perspective.
Yeah, no doubt. We hear all the time from advertisers that, leaned heavily into social the last several years, especially during the pandemic, and they're just not getting the returns anymore. And audio is where they're moving budget. Maybe not as fast as you'd like to see, but they are moving budget there because they are seeing returns, and now they're trying to scale it. So really helpful, Jordan. Thank you for being here in the Matrix today. Yep. It was
Thank
very
you
insightful.
For the invitation. I love talking about audio, and we'll talk anybody's ears off that will let me.
Excellent. Well, hopefully more people will. With that, take care.
Thanks, Sean.
Episode of the MarTech Matrix was brought to you by the Cogent Collective, a community for marketing and e-commerce leaders. Learn more and inquire about membership at cogentcollective.com. For show notes and information on upcoming episodes, head on over to the martechmatrix.com, where you can submit questions for upcoming guests. Once again, thank you, Jordan, for joining us today and educating our audience on today's audio advertising landscape. If you would like to learn more about AudioHook and see if they're a good fit for your marketing strategy, send Sean a note to sean@cogentcollective.com. New episodes of the MarTech Matrix podcast will drop every Monday, so be sure to subscribe with your favorite podcast network so you can stay on top of what's happening in the Matrix. Next week, Michelle Bacharach, CEO of FindMine, will enter the Matrix to discuss how e-commerce brands can alleviate the content bottleneck wherever it exists, and how it will lead to more sales and stronger loyalty, so be sure to tune in. Until then, don't get lost in the MarTech Matrix.